Previously on Tabletop Tips.
In the next episode, I want to take this mostly improvised and spitballed idea of an adventure and turn it into something mechanical, something you can actually run in your adventures.
Currently,
a circus and I am a clown.
After several days' travel, you find yourself at the rusty sign of the Cracked Cup Tavern and Inn, a respite for the weariest of travelers. Pushing past the heavy wood door, you're greeted with the thick musk of alcohol, sticky wooden floors, and the chatter of a full dining hall. Locals are chattering about their day, smoking pipes, while a group of older men play cards in the corner, cursing and accusing each other of cheating. With direction from the Dragonborn bartender, you find yourself seated at a booth among a colorful group of strangers. As the waiter brings you around a frothy ale, a dark-haired half-elf with a gray eye limps towards your table, puffing billows of smoke from her yellowed pipe. She leans against the table and says, "Strangers, you look armed and capable. Would you mind helping me with a predicament?" Hey everyone, I'm Greg, and I'm back to help you run your first tabletop RPG adventure. I know it's been a while, unfortunately life finds a way of getting in the way, but we're back. If you watched our last episode, I ran through my scatterbrained, improvised brainstorming process for creating an adventure for fantasy RPGs, and I came up with a framework for an adventure for a low-level party. And as promised, I'm back to help you turn that fun idea for an adventure into something playable. So if you haven't seen our previous episode, check that out in the link in the description, watch it, and come back here. And after this video's out, I'll already be working on the next few videos revolving around how to create amazing characters for your fantasy RPG games, so be sure to subscribe so you know when those videos come out. If you're just starting out in this hobby, and I'm assuming you are, you should know that this creative process for turning an adventure idea into something playable is going to be the hardest part of the process at first. This is why pre-made adventures exist. They save you the arduous task of planning. You just have to read the adventure and understand what you're doing. But I find the homemade adventures to be the most rewarding. They have your personal stamp on them, and they're how these games were played in the early days of this hobby's conception. But regardless of which route you take, starting off as a dungeon master is really scary. You're playing the roles of a narrator, multiple characters, a referee, and an improv artist, and that's at the base level. It's really daunting. So when I started off writing the script for this video, it went on for pages and pages, explaining as many rules as possible to help you get a pretty good idea of how to be a great DM, even if you've never played a tabletop RPG before in your life. And then I realized I was basically narrating a bunch of rule books. This video series shouldn't be a replacement for reading the rules of your game of choice. This is a supplement to help you improve your understanding of tabletop RPGs and help boost your talent in playing the game. So, I've drastically shortened the script, leaving behind the bare essentials. This is still going to be a really long video, but it won't be an hour long. Probably. Hopefully. The goals of this video are simple. 1. Teach you how to turn the idea of an adventure into something playable, even for someone who has next to no idea what they're doing. 2. Define some of the basic terms a newbie should know before getting into this hobby. 3. Give you a decent grasp of the basic structure of running the game. 4. Show you my personal techniques on how I prepare to run the game, and finally, provide enough insight that anyone can finish watching this video and walk away having gained inspiration, insight, or really anything of worth at all. So let's get started. For you first-timers in the world of tabletop RPGs, it can be very confusing figuring out how to run the game when there's all of these terms being thrown around you've never heard before. Sessions, DCs, encounters, armor class, lore, saving throws. Some of these terms are self-explanatory, but others, not so much. And it's easy to get lost in this web of terminology. So as we embark on building this beginner adventure, we'll be defining some key terms so we're all on the same page and you can run a game as smooth as butter. First things first, let's learn the language you'll need to sell the pitch for your game. In other words, let's define the differences between a campaign, an adventure, and a session. This will be important for figuring out how long you want your game to run, and thus how much adventure prep you'll need to do. A session is one meeting of gameplay. Most sessions run between 3 to 5 hours long in my experience, although I have heard legends of people playing for as long as 12 hours, but that's far from the norm, and honestly, if you do that, you're a little bit crazy. Think of a session as one episode of a TV show. Some episodes are 11 minutes long, most are between 22 to 44 minutes long, and others can go on for an hour and a half. It really all depends on the team that's running the show. Then that makes an adventure a quest or story that takes multiple sessions to complete. The important thing to remember about an adventure is that your party might not make a ton of progress on the adventure itself on every session. There's some sessions where you'll find the players are grinding through the adventure proper, leaving you scrambling to improvise what they have to do next. And other sessions, they'll spend an hour haggling with stable hands trying to buy decent horses at a discounted rate. Either way, all sessions are important and valid in the course of running the adventure. So think of the adventure as a season of a television show. Some episodes are filler, and others are very important to the story of the season, but without every episode, the season is not complete. And finally, there's the campaign. A campaign is a series of adventures strung together to form a greater narrative. If a session is an episode, and an adventure is a season, then a campaign is the full TV show. So keep these terms in mind when you're pitching your game to your party to set the proper expectations. Are you planning on running a one-shot adventure that will run its course through one session? Are you running an adventure that will take a couple weeks to finish? Or are you planning on a full-blown campaign that might go on indefinitely? With this in mind, we'll be designing this adventure with two goals in mind. The first goal is one that you should have for every session. The goal to make sure everyone is having fun. The second goal is to train our new players on how to think within the rules of the game. The world of tabletop RPGs might surprise new players because of one simple truth. This is a game where you can try anything. In this storytelling medium, you are not limited by the code programmed in a video game, or what images the director captured in the frame of a film, or even the text that makes up the rules of the game. Your only limits are your imagination and the roll of the dice. But new players might not realize that until they've had this aha moment, and that could come at any time for any reason. But once they realize their options are limitless, you can take them anywhere. So with all that preamble out of the way, this adventure will be designed for a party of 5 players at the first level. Depending on both the pace of your game and where you decide to start this adventure, this can be run as a one-shot or as an adventure that spans between 2 to 3 sessions. Let's run with the assumption you want this adventure to last a couple sessions and build the adventure from there. We'll start at the Tavern, which we'll call the Cracked Cup Tavern and Inn. If you plan on making this tavern an important location for your story, I'd suggest giving it an interesting feature to make it more memorable for your players. Maybe this tavern is filled with the music plucked from a lute on the wall that plays itself, or the bartender makes a special drink that helps you burp fire. Or maybe the interesting feature isn't a thing, but a person. Maybe this bar is run by a race you don't commonly see in your setting, like a furbolg or a drow. By making the setting memorable, your players will remember it a few sessions down the line when it comes up again in the story. If you forget the name, you'll remember the place. And since we have a tavern, we should probably have some kind of menu for our players to order from. It's the little details like this that often trip up dungeon masters in the writing process, so if you're like me and need the occasional creative nudge, I suggest finding a really good online generator. For generating taverns, Donjon has a great tavern generator that randomizes everything from the location and appearance of the tavern to the owner, interesting patrons, local rumors, and what we need for our purposes, the menu. So with a couple clicks on the subjects we want to change, we can just cycle through, writing down the details that we like, and adjusting them to taste. Boom! There's our menu for this tavern. I'd suggest writing this down on a handout to present to your players. Since we're starting in a tavern for this adventure, once you describe the setting, start off by asking each of the players at your table to describe what their characters look like. I usually phrase it something along the lines of, describe what your character looks like. Don't say your name or age or anything like that, just describe what everyone else at the table sees. Saying that specifically is important, because when asked to describe their characters, a lot of first-time players will often get into the fiddly details like age, class, and reciting the entire backstory they may or may not have written down for their character. It's funny if everyone in the table accidentally brought a half-orc monk with the criminal background, but if you're aiming to have an immersive, narrative-driven game, it's unrealistic for new people to meet each other for the first time and instantly know the name of the gnome's mom who was tragically killed by goblins. After all, I don't know about you guys, but when I meet someone for the first time, I don't waddle up to them and say, "Hey, I'm Greg, I'm 24, a Gemini cusp, I work in customer service, and I have a crippling need for people to like me. What's your name?" Typically, the first thing people see when they meet me is some skinny, long-haired, white-passing punk with glasses and some facial hair. Likewise, that's going to be the first impression of a person's character. There will be a time and place to drop surprises about character backstories and lineages in future games, so have just a little bit of patience, don't worry. Once everyone's described their character, present the party with a waiter who asks them what they'd like to order. This is how your players are going to practice getting into character and role-playing for the first time. Between speaking with the waiter in character and establishing the differences between what the players know and what their characters experience, you will further emphasize that there is a crucial difference between player knowledge and character knowledge. Very important, we'll have a future video on that because it's a big topic. This tavern is where our adventurers will meet Aposte, the half-elf archivist who lives in the outskirts of town. So when the timing is right, she'll approach the party and detail how she's become the recent victim of a break-in. The long and the short of it is, she left early in the morning to run some errands, and left her apprentice, Ronnie, to watch over the storehouse. And when she returned, she found the front door smashed in off its hinges, and a ransacked archive. Ronnie was gone, along with the key tied to the dwarf Durhar Bronzeblade. Whatever petty thieves took it must have heard the legend of old Hollowbone Hill. She's worried that whoever stole that key might hurt Ronnie trying to unearth the secrets of Durhar's mine. If you rescue Ronnie and secure Durhar's treasure for her, she might reward you. Presenting the party this quest might prompt some players to ask about the legend of Old Hollowbone Hill. If there's a player in the party whose character is a local to the town, or has a reason to know this legend, collaborate with them before the session happens and let them know some of the rumors of Hollowbone Hill. Giving player characters information about the world that they get to exposit to the party is an awesome moment that helps make the game feel more immersive, especially if the rumors that they give out turn out to be false. If none of your players have any reason to know this legend beforehand, there's a few paths you can go down. Some players might ask Aposte about this legend of Hollowbone Hill, to which she might explain that there is simply a rumor that Durhar was buried in the mine with his favorite weapon from his past career as an adventurer. Alternatively, a player might turn to you, the dungeon master, and ask, "Would I know anything about this?" At which point, you might ask the player to make a skill check. On the character sheet, you'll find a series of skills listed next to your ability scores, which your players might have filled in having no idea what they're used for. Well, here's their purpose. Skill checks are how the game determines whether or not a character is successful in a certain skill that they want to perform. Any skill check can be performed by anyone and can be called on for anything such as recalling information, attempts at deductive reasoning, tests of might, skill, deception, etc, etc. That little number next to the skill on the player's character sheet is their skill modifier, which tells us how skilled or unskilled the character is in that subject. A positive skill modifier is above average, a negative number is below average, and a 0 is the average. Your basic commoner might have a 0 in every skill. So in this instance, a character is asking the dungeon master to recall information regarding a local legend in the town. So you would have them make a history skill check in order to recall this information by having them roll their dice and add or subtract their history skill modifier. Alright, so now we have the total numbered roll, but what number do they need to roll in order to determine if they are successful or they fail? That leads us to the DC, or difficulty check. The DC is the number that the total roll has to match or surpass in order to succeed in the skill check. The lower a DC is, the easier it is to succeed in that skill check, as shown on page 174 of your player's handbook. A skill check's DC might differ from character to character, and that's an important thing to consider when setting the difficulty for each person. A history check to recall information might be lower for a bookworm who studied that subject, and it might be higher for the illiterate barbarian. Speaking with Aposte also provides the players a role-playing opportunity which can very well become an encounter. An encounter is any person, place, object, or event that challenges the forward progress of the party. The most obvious encounters are combat encounters, but encounters can be anything from a series of skill checks to puzzles and traps, and in this case, a social interaction. My anxiety peeps know exactly how scary this can be. When players get this quest from Aposte, you as a DM should be ready for a social encounter in the form of responses from the players. Depending on both how the party phrases their requests and the nature of the request itself, you can set up skill checks for persuasion, deception, or intimidation accordingly. If your players are like mine, the first concern they'll have is satisfying their hungry wallets, after which they'll probably try to recruit Aposte to join them in the adventure, mostly to use as a meat shield in order to throw them in front of danger and save their own skins, and assuming that she survives all of that horrible trauma, they'll probably use her as a scapegoat to blame her when their haphazard plans blow up in their face. The natural ones are not good people, but by God are they chaotic fun. Now, last episode I briefly touched on the 3 basic types of NPCs that a player can run into, that being helpful, neutral, and antagonistic. And while I characterize most quest givers as being helpful NPCs, they're mostly helpful in that they're willing to pay the adventuring party for their help. You can totally have a quest giver be a neutral NPC, someone who just does not care for the party at all or the methods they use, as long as the job gets done at a fair and reasonable price. So depending on how you decide to characterize Aposte and how your players approach her, this will adjust whether she's helpful, neutral, or antagonistic, and this should also play into the social encounter itself. A helpful Aposte might be very open and forthcoming, willing to help the party in any way she can, resulting in easier skill checks for friendly and helpful interactions. Alternatively, a neutral Aposte might be a bit more reserved, unwilling to tell total strangers why burglars would want to steal some rusty old key from her archive. Meanwhile, if your players push her buttons to their limit, well, she might become antagonistic and want them out of her sight as soon as possible. Just get the boy and be gone. With the quest given and hopefully accepted, the players will get to engage in the adventure proper. If you have the party inspect Aposte's study to figure out who broke in, you can have players roll some investigation checks to find evidence of the intruders. This is a great opportunity to introduce a skill check that has multiple levels of success, which is something I love to use in my games. A skill check with multiple DCs is the same as a standard skill check, except with a single roll, a player might gain multiple levels of information depending on how high they roll, giving some players more of an edge over others. This helps make the characters look like they're more well versed in the subject, or notice something everyone else didn't, which leads to fun moments thanks to random dice rolls. In the case of this investigation check, I would have the DC be 5 to find a set of muddy footprints, and a DC of 10 to find an unusual set of colorful scales littered across the floor. From there, it'd be obvious at first glance that these footprints are not from a human shoe, so a nature check can be rolled to determine these footprints are those of a goblin. A similar nature check on the flaked scales would reveal that those belong to kobolds. However, good advice for dungeon masters here: if they don't reach that higher DC in order to get the information, do not tell them what they missed out on. Never ever reveal unused content from your games, because ultimately, you can reuse that content later. And even if you don't reuse that content, when has anyone discovered the secrets of every single thing about our world? We've barely explored the oceans. Now let's decide you have this investigation angle to the adventure, and the party fails to notice the kobold scales thanks to really low investigation rolls. If you're nice, you might not want your party to go up to Hollowbone Hill and be surprised when there's kobolds up there alongside the goblins. So being the benevolent DM, when the players tell Aposte it was goblins who broke into her study, she might respond with something like, "Good job, you've passed the test. Although I'm not sure how those goblins plan to get past the kobolds in the old mine, they're, very territorial." So now you've set up a fun twist when the players discover that these territorial kobolds are actually working with the goblins, not against them. Keep in mind, if your players are first timers, at any point they might start to experience choice paralysis. Since this is a game where you can technically try anything, they might not know what they can try to do. So be sure you're asking them what they want to do and present options for them if they're stuck. It's the sign of a bad dungeon master who slays new players for the crime of being new to the game. Thinking within the rules of a game system is a reflex that has to be learned and practiced. As an example, if you've just started heading up to the mines of Durhar, ask them if they want to travel stealthily. They might not have thought of that before. Explain to them that by traveling stealthily, it means they have to roll a stealth check and be harder to spot by the enemy, but they'll be moving at a slower pace. They'll probably still want to enter stealth mode, but now they know the pros and the cons, and they know they can't just declare, "I run into the cave screaming at the top of my lungs, and I stab the first goblin I see to death, stabbing and stabbing and stabbing, and then I drink from their still twitching corpse all of their blood and essence, stealthily." It's not gonna happen. Once the players start the journey to Hollowbone Hill, you want to set up a combat encounter that lets the players get a taste of what's in store for them. Using the pit trap in the road idea from the last episode is a great appetizer for future combats, because it'll show off the dynamics between the goblins and the kobolds in a relatively safe environment. This allows the players to mentally prepare for what kind of strategies they have to use to succeed on this adventure. And worst case scenario, if they're hurt extra badly by this first encounter, they have the chance to still go back to the town, re-strategize, gather supplies, and go back up to the hill to try again. Only now, the goblins and kobolds will be ready for them. Remember, the bad guys want to win. Finding these traps will take a perception check. I'd say that the pit trap should be a 10 by 10 square, so we'll call it a DC of 12 to spot. It is pretty big after all. But I'd also like to put down some bear traps near the pit that are harder to find. Maybe they're decently hidden in a tall, bushy tuft of crabgrass, so let's say that the DC is 14 to find the bear traps. Falling into the pit trap means you fall 10 feet and take fall damage. According to page 183 of the player's handbook, for every 10 feet you fall, you take 1d6 bludgeoning damage, up to a maximum of 20d6 of damage. Yeesh! If you want the pit trap to be extra nasty, you can throw some spikes in the bottom, which deal an additional 1d4 piercing damage to anyone who falls inside. Assuming you use the nasty version of this pit trap, anyone who falls for this trap will take 1d6 fall damage and 1d4 piercing damage from the spikes, and they have to figure out how to climb out of this 10-foot deep hole. As for the bear traps, you can find it under Hunting Trap in the equipment section of the player's handbook. A creature that steps on this trap must make a DC 13 dexterity saving throw or be trapped, receiving 1d4 piercing damage as the trap clamps around their leg, and ending all of their movement they were taking for that turn. You have to break free of the trap if you want to keep moving, and if the trap creature doesn't break free of the trap, they are restricted by the length of the chain, which is on average about 3 feet long and staked in the ground near the trap. For clarification there, a saving throw is a special type of skill check that is used to resist or avoid the effects of a trap, attack, or magical effect. And that term creature, it might sound a little bit odd, but it's just a blanket term in the game that refers to all types of living things, including plants. Okay, great, but why these traps specifically? Well, I've balanced them out this way. The pit trap deals more damage, but it's larger and easier to spot, so failing to locate it is extra punishing damage-wise. Meanwhile, the hunting trap is harder to spot, but not as punishing damage-wise. The real danger with both of these traps lie in the movement restrictions. See, the fact of the matter is, if these traps were on their own, it would be the pit trap that's more deadly than the hunting trap. But they don't exist in a vacuum here. You're in the middle of combat. If you don't climb out of the pit, the goblins and kobolds aren't going to run over to the pit and fire arrows at you until the rest of the party's been taken care of. So while you're somewhat safe from combat down there, your party has to hit twice as hard to compensate for you being out of the combat rotation. Meanwhile, if you're stuck in the bear trap, you can still make your attacks, but you can't move freely, and that makes you a very easy target to hit. But have no fear, intrepid adventurer, you don't even have to make an active perception roll to notice these traps. At the bottom of your stats and skills on your character sheets, there's a little skill called passive perception. What the hell does that even mean? The passive perception skill is the number that shows how perceptive your character is naturally, even when they aren't actively focusing on their environment. If a player's passive perception is higher than DC of the trap, they notice that trap right away, unless they rolled for perception and got a lower number. After all, even the most perceptive people fail to find their keys from time to time. Upon activating or noticing the traps, your player might hear rustling from the nearby bushes and trees. Suddenly, from out of the bushes leap kobolds, these shrimpy, 3-foot-tall bipedal lizard-like creatures with long snouts that are a cross between a dog and a crocodile, swinging leather slings over their heads. At the same time, dropping down from the tree canopy are goblins with their long floppy ears, large noses, jagged blades, and sharp teeth clenched in a snarl. Roll for initiative. That phrase, roll for initiative, means that the combat encounter has begun. Initiative is how we determine the order of combat. Everyone rolls their d20 and adds their initiative bonus, which is usually their dexterity modifier. The highest rolls go first. Now, as a dungeon master, it might be pretty annoying to roll initiative for large groups of monsters, so what I like to do is roll initiative for the monsters in groups. In other words, all the goblins get 1 initiative, all the kobolds get 1 initiative, so I roll my d20 twice and I'm good to go. Easy peasy. You can run combat as a theater of the mind experience like the rest of the game, but you won't always want to run it that way. That's where the battle map and the rules of combat come into play. The battle map is a grid that tracks movement, size, and placement of the characters. Most folks use a grid of 1-inch squares, which is what I prefer, but others use the hex grid. The battle map helps us track movement by giving us a sense of scale, with a 1-inch cube being 5 cubic feet of space. Therefore, if you have a movement speed of 30 feet, you can move up to 6 squares away from your current location on your turn. Combat takes place over a series of rounds. 1 round is equal to roughly 6 seconds of real-world time passing. Thus, 10 rounds of combat is equal to 1 minute of real-world time. Keep that in mind for features such as the Barbarian's Rage, or spells that last up to 1 minute with concentration. A round is over once everyone has taken their turn in initiative order. The aim of combat is to reduce the enemy to 0 hit points or to make them flee, while ensuring that you don't reach 0 hit points. If your player character hits 0 hit points, you have to make death saving throws to determine if they stay alive or if they die. You'll find the rules for that in the player's handbook. Now, just because you hit 0 hit points doesn't always mean that you've died, it just means that you're unconscious. So what can you do on your turn? The 4 major acts you can perform on your turn in combat is using your action, your bonus action, your reaction, and your movement. You can conduct these actions in any order you like. You can move 10 feet, attack, and then use the rest of your movement. You can use your bonus action before your main action, or you can just do nothing at all. It's up to you to determine how you use your turn. And again, make sure your players know that this is an option. They might think they have to make an attack and then move, or that they can't move after they make an attack, and that's not always the case. Everyone has different actions they can make on their turn, and they have different restrictions they'll have to remember for their characters. For now, I've included a link in the description to a very handy cheat sheet that has all the sorts of actions that can happen in a turn of combat. Okay, so that's basically how combat is run, but how do I balance the encounter? How do I make sure that I'm not throwing a freaking Tarrasque at my players, and that that's not fair? Well, monsters now have something called CR, or challenge rating. It's a balancing system that helps ensure you don't throw monsters at your players that will kill them in one shot. It's not a perfect system, but it does help a lot, especially if you're new to the hobby. Calculating the CR balance of an encounter is a lot of confusing math that I honestly never bothered learning. There's a lot of great combat calculators online that'll help you calculate the balance really quickly, such as Kobold Fight Club or the aforementioned Donjon. Just add your rows, grouping together different player levels and monster challenge ratings, and boom, you'll know in a couple seconds how difficult your encounter is. We're gonna throw 2 goblins and 3 kobolds at our players for this first encounter. Based on this calculation, this will be a medium challenge encounter for a party of 5 first level players. This is a pretty solid system for newbies, but don't rely on the challenge rating system for everything because it can be very deceptive. As an example, a Banshee has a challenge rating of 4, so you'd think that a higher level party can wipe the floor with one. However, a Banshee can wail once per day, and anyone who hears this and fails the saving throw instantly drops to 0 hit points. When you're facing a Banshee, it doesn't matter if you're level 1 or level 20. All it takes is one bad roll on a monster like this, and boom, you're dead. So make sure you understand what your monsters do before you throw them at your players. So now let's talk strategy. How do we use our goblins and kobolds? Well, let's look at their basic stats for each one and see if we can fiddle with them a bit. When looking at a stat block for a monster, remember that what's presented in your gamebooks are examples of the average specimen of that creature. You can and should practice with tweaking the stats to fit your needs depending on the adventure. So for the goblin, the stats are pretty basic. Not too strong, charismatic, or wise, but the average goblin doesn't need to be. Their armor class is 15, but that's assuming they're wearing leather armor and holding a shield. So let's lose that shield so their armor class becomes 13. Aside from that, they have a great little feature called Nimble Escape, which lets them disengage or hide as a bonus action. Very handy. Then there's the kobolds. Notice, their armor class is lower than the goblins, but that's because these are the stats for a kobold with no armor and no shield. Therefore, the stats are assuming that the average kobold runs around in a loincloth. If you want to make them slightly harder to hit, which I recommend for this adventure, I suggest giving these kobolds some leather armor, which will make their AC 13 just like our goblins. After all, it makes sense that a kobold defending the road to their home from invaders wouldn't be jumping into combat wearing only a loincloth. Kobolds are pretty bad at everything except for dexterity, definitely among one of the weakest of the humanoid races. But here's two things to keep in mind. First is their sunlight sensitivity. They get disadvantage on all attack and perception rolls made against anything in direct sunlight. We don't want that, so we'll make sure to make this encounter happen under a shady canopy of trees. Boom, no more disadvantage. And finally, there's the pack tactics, which allows the kobold to make attacks at advantage if an ally is within 5 feet of their target, and the target isn't incapacitated. Awesome, so if any of their allies are within 5 feet of the target, our kobolds get to roll their d20s twice to attack, and take the higher number. We can work with this greatly. So now, with this encounter, we get to show our players what they're going up against in Hollowbone Hill. We'll make the goblins rush in, do their attacks, and disengage as a bonus action to get out of the fight and separate the party. When the melee players inevitably give chase to bonk the goblins with their swords, the kobolds will attack them with advantage from a safe distance. Seeing this battle strategy firsthand lets the players evaluate what combat style is a bigger risk for them based on their class and stats.
Wow, so we've spent quite a bit of time learning how to run this first combat encounter. Will every combat be this complicated? Not really. When you're new, all of these rules feel like a lot. It's very overwhelming, but with experience and playtime, it all comes naturally. Besides, almost every single combat encounter uses the same rules, so if you can run one combat encounter, you're pretty well set for a beginner. Entering the mines of Hollowbone Hill, the players will likely encounter more traps that are set by the kobolds. These traps are intended to prevent would-be invaders from entering further into the caves, and allows the kobolds to come in and take away prisoners. Let's go with that rope noose trap from last episode. Let's say it's a DC 12 perception check to spot and avoid it. It's a rope in a cave. It's dark, but once you notice it, it's really obvious. If the trap gets triggered, the player must make a DC 13 dexterity saving throw or get yoinked up by their ankle to the ceiling like they're in a cartoon. If a player activates the trap, you get a random encounter. Nothing too crazy, maybe just 2 or 3 kobolds who are on their patrol and they heard the trap getting activated. Will this encounter become another combat encounter or a roleplay scenario? That's up to how you and your players react. Maybe the players try to trick the kobolds and convince them that they're not invaders, they were invited by the leader of the goblins for a birthday party. But it's a surprise, so don't let anyone know. Or they might just stab the little lizard dogs to death. Within these caves, I want to add a couple areas that show this isn't just a hallway that leads straight to the boss room. This should feel like a kobold habitat that is now under occupation by the goblins. The goal of this exercise is to enhance the verisimilitude, or believability, of this area. You need to be able to say realistically that yes, kobolds definitely live here, and the goblins are totally butting into their space, bro.
So in this tunnel system, you should probably make enough space for at least 3 to 4 rooms worth of kobold lodgings. One chamber could be where the kobolds sleep. This room is a complex net of hammocks that weave from wall to wall like a spider web. Against the walls are some pools of stagnant water where they can relax and rest. Perceptive players may notice that some of the hammocks have been ripped down and are now little mats on the floor caked in goblin filth. A second room would be where the kobolds cook and eat, a mess hall of sorts. There's a big, roaring fire against one wall of the room, and a couple of teeny tiny tables and stools for the kobolds to dine at scattered throughout. Maybe there's some kobolds staring as the goblins rummage through their chest of edible goods, judging them. A player who speaks goblin may eavesdrop and hear the goblins complaining that all these dumb lizards have to eat are moldy meat, chunks of bark, and yucky centipedes. Ugh. The third room would be that egg room from the last video. A big fire in the center of the room helps keep the eggs warm, and there's a pair of goblins arguing with some kobolds, who are protecting the eggs from these ever so hungry goblins. And for the fourth room, you can make a little alcove where the kobolds store their treasure, for any of your players who are suffering from sticky finger syndrome. But don't feel restrained by what I've outlined here. Get creative with it. Now, let's get to that boss room. The players walk in on a conversation between a hulking, hairy bugbear and the smoke projection of a powerful wizard goblin. Standing next to the bugbear is a kobold with shining, shimmering scales who stands with a confidence that is lacking in the other kobolds you've encountered so far. The bugbear tells the projection that they need to sacrifice the boy at midnight in order to open the sealed door to the tomb and retrieve the weapon. That's when your rogue, who rolled impressively low for stealth, accidentally tripped over their own feet, their thud against the hard stone floor echoing through the room. The kobold sorcerer, having spotted our heroes, points to the players and screams, "Intruders!" Roll for initiative. This is our boss encounter, so this should be the hardest hitting combat encounter our players face. With that being said, we're not trying to kill anyone in their first night playing this game, so let's talk tactics. Our main boss is the bugbear. His base stats make him beefy and hard to hit, though without a shield, the armor class is a 14, which is doable for our newbie heroes. The big thing of note is the bugbear's brute feature, which lets it deal an additional die of damage upon hit. Our stat block accounts for this and includes the extra die in the damage calculation. Nice. Next, we have the Kobold Scale Sorcerer, whose stats are found in Volo's Guide to Monsters. It has natural armor, which makes it harder to hit than our bugbear without his shield, but the basic stats give them the same health. Since the Sorcerer's armor class is higher than the bugbear's, I'm gonna give the Sorcerer less health to help balance things out. This makes the bugbear our hard-hitting damage sponge that the players can wheel attacks on, while the Kobold Sorcerer is harder to hit but slightly more frail. Additionally, our Kobold Sorcerer has pack tactics, which is gonna be clutch in granting advantage on spell attacks, but the big feature of note is the spells and sorcery points. Sorcery points allow sorcerers to modify their spells, and the basic stats for this sorcerer includes heightened spell and subtle spell, both ripped straight from the sorcerer class for players. Subtle spell could be useful if our players plan to capture the sorcerer alive, and he tries to escape or attack without being noticed, but it might not be handy in basic combat. Meanwhile, heightened spell has big potential, forcing one player to take disadvantage on a saving throw for a spell that he casts, but that'll leave the sorcerer without any sorcery points left. As for his spells, we have some good ones included here. The cantrips are all pretty solid. Firebolt is one of the best damaging cantrips in the game, while Mending and Mage Hand are great for roleplay and utility outside of combat. And then there's Poison Spray, which honestly kinda sucks, but we can just not use it or swap it out for another fun sorcerer cantrip. I always suggest Prestidigitation. If you decide to swap out Poison Spray and still plan on using the heightened spell feature, you're gonna need to replace the spell the sorcerer has with one that needs a DC, because Poison Spray is the only spell on the stat block that can use that, which seems like an odd design choice to me. Moving on, the first and second level spells included here are all pretty great. Charm Person would be great for a role-playing opportunity if the players capture the sorcerer. Chromatic Orb is also a pretty monstrous spell to use against your players at this level. Dealing 3d6 points of elemental damage of your choice, this could easily kill a wizard or sorcerer player in one hit, so be careful with it. If you're gonna keep the spell, I don't suggest using it against your players. That being said, the 50 gold diamond it needs to be cast could be a nice piece of treasure if your players loot him. Then there's Expeditious Retreat. I would save a spell slot specifically to use this spell, and I'll tell you why in a moment. Finally, with our second level spell, we have Scorching Ray. It lets you attack up to 3 different creatures or hit one character 3 times. Great spell, I'd keep it. Now, according to our encounter calculator, with just the bugbear and the scale sorcerer, this would be a deadly encounter for our players based on the stats in the book. We've fiddled with the armor class and the health a little bit, but that still might not be enough for our players to beat both of these characters. But I've already fallen in love with this idea for the encounter, so what should I do? That's when I fall on the advice that I always give to new dungeon masters. If you have a scene idea, make it cinematic. Here's the idea. You might have some goblins or kobolds show up to the battle upon hearing the scuffle, but they don't jump in on the already hard encounter. When they show up, have the bugbear roar at them to stay back and to let this battle finish as it started. This keeps the stakes high and believable while telegraphing to your players that the danger is real, but manageable. It's kind of like playing Pokemon. You can run away from a wild encounter, which are generally easier, but the tougher trainer battles are inescapable. Bugbears might be dumb, but giving them this sense of warrior's honor is fun and interesting. They're these big, imposing guys who live for the thrill of combat. Make it clear that they care very much about adhering to these rules of battle. If the player characters try to spare the bugbear, make him insist on being slain to preserve his honor as a warrior. Another way to keep this battle cinematic and manageable is to prepare a planned event. Much like the appearance of the goblin backup, whenever one of our 2 boss monsters hits half health, the kobold sorcerer will scream out "Retreat!" in Draconic and cast Expeditious Retreat on himself. He will then spend every turn and action he can running away like a coward, along with all the other kobolds in the cave. As the sorcerer runs away, you can have the bugbear react in rage. Maybe he uses his reaction to throw one of his javelins at the sorcerer and scream out, "Coward! No honor!" In addition to making the stakes seem higher than they actually are, this allows our kobolds to become a recurring character for future adventures. See plot hooks from the last episode for ideas on that. Regardless of how dangerous an encounter is, you always want for your players to believe that one wrong move is all that separates them from a red splat on the wall. Using these planned cinematics allows for us as dungeon masters to have our cake and eat it too. It lets our players feel powerful while steering the story in a direction that is preferable for us. I mean, nothing feels better as a player than feeling powerful. Imagine sitting there as a first player character and thinking, wow, we took down a bugbear and the kobolds ran away scared with their tails between their legs. We're awesome! Upon beating this boss encounter, the player should be able to rescue Ronnie and be able to loot a health potion or two off of the bugbear, depending on how low your party is health-wise. It should be assumed that all the kobolds followed their leader and escaped. So have some goblins show up, and upon seeing the bugbear lieutenant slain, have them run away in fear as well. If your party insists on keeping the bugbear alive, he should insist that the other goblins not attack the party. Again, we're not trying to kill a bunch of first level players and ruin their first night in this hobby. With the threat being neutralized, the players then get to deal with the tomb. If the players are having a difficult time dealing with that puzzle door presented in the last episode, you can have them make a perception check to find a loose stone on the wall, which pops out to reveal a small diagram of a planetary system. It doesn't have to be a full solar system, mind you, just enough where it shows the moon of your world as a helpful hint to your players. Descending into the tomb, we're keeping things as is with the false burial chamber and the descent into the real tomb. So let's talk about that hallway with the raised tiles. This trap room is a wide, long hallway with a series of raised tiles along the floor, with each tile sporting one of a handful of symbols. The biggest thing about this trap room is making it feel like a legitimate danger to would-be thieves. The best way to do that is to ensure a variety of the pattern that you find on the floor. This trap is just as much a psychological game as it is a threat to your player's physical health. Once someone steps on the wrong tile and activates the trap, the player must make a DC 12 dexterity saving throw. On a failure, a barbed metal marble shoots out from a hole in the wall, dealing 1d4 piercing damage. So how do the players find out which tiles they shouldn't step on? When it comes to tile room traps, I like to make it so that any creature that weighs under 50 pounds cannot activate the tile fully. Light creatures get a half click from the tile, which doesn't activate the trap. Meanwhile, heavier characters get the full click, setting it off. So if your party decided to send out the gnome or halfling as a test subject to get hit by the trap seems completely harmless or deactivated. Therefore, the key to figuring out which tiles are dangerous is a successful perception check, which will reveal dark stains around the borders of the dangerous tiles. This is long dried blood, the result of being a victim of the trap. Now, let's move on to that burial chamber. Last episode, you might remember me describing how as the sarcophagus gets unlocked, the stone eyes and mouth of Durhar carved into the lid of the sarcophagus open in a creepy fashion, unleashing a puff of toxic gas. At this point, your players might be at low health and you might not want to set off a poison trap for them. It's okay to have something that you planned out and then just not use it. That just means you can use it in a future adventure. But if you're sadistic and you still want the poison trap to go off, I suggest that this poison trap not deal any direct damage. Instead, make any player who fails a DC 12 Constitution saving throw gain the poisoned condition for 1 hour. A player can make a DC 12 investigation check to figure out there's a trap within the mechanism for the sarcophagus, and anyone who lockpicks it with a DC 12 lockpicking check can disarm the trap. So our players open the sarcophagus, and there in Durhar's grip is the magic weapon they were tasked with retrieving. Remember to make sure this magic item is something that your players can use. If you have a party entirely made of spellcasters, Durhar's treasured weapon could just as easily be an arcane focus like a wand or a crystal orb. Hell, maybe the item they're retrieving isn't a magic weapon at all. Maybe it's some archaic artifact that Durhar himself stole in a previous adventure. But as far as a magical weapon, plenty of classes and races give players proficiencies in short swords, so that's a solid bet if for whatever reason you don't know what kinds of weapons your players can use. So now they've grabbed Durhar's magical weapon and they think the adventure's over. Just as the players are entering a false sense of security, the rotting corpse of Durhar rises from his slumber, hand axes at the ready, and lunges at the party. Roll for initiative.
So for this last encounter, we wanted to feel important and cinematic without downing our players, who might be worse for wear after a day of traps and battles. We want them to feel the threat of this evil tomb without it overpowering them. First, let's talk about Durhar Bronzeblade. Obviously we're gonna make him a zombie, so let's look at the base stats for one and see what we're working with. Looks like this stat block assumes you're using a commoner zombie. No armor, no weapons, just a shambling corpse ready to punch whoever's in their way. The Undead Fortitude feature is going to be a fun way to frustrate our players, but otherwise, this base stat block is a little easy. Let's tweak this bad boy. So, Durhar was a dwarf who once lived the life of an adventurer. We're gonna assume for the sake of simplicity that our player characters have already secured the magic weapon when he gets up, so he's not hitting our players too hard. Even without his most treasured item, he would have still been given a ceremonial burial with a nice set of armor and maybe some hand axes at his side. So, let's add that to the stat block. We'll say he uses his strength to attack, so the slam attack is pretty close to what he'll be hitting with a hand axe. Just replace the bludgeoning damage with slashing damage, and boom, you're good to go. As for the armor, he would have been buried here for a while, so we should keep in mind what he was buried in. Let's give him a set of studded leather armor that's falling apart. This would make his armor class 12 plus his dexterity modifier, which is a -2, so his armor class is now a 10. He's still easy to hit, but he's not as big a pushover as he would be without armor. And since his armor is falling apart due to age, we can say that if a player scores a critical hit against Durhar, it rips a hole through the decaying leather, making his AC 8 as normal. It'll be a fun little cinematic moment that makes our players feel powerful after enduring an adventure that may have challenged them more than expected. Now, that one zombie will be cool, but we need some more forces so he doesn't go down in one round. So, when Durhar rises from his slumber, we'll say that a pack of skeletons equal to the number of party members crawls out of the holes in the walls to attack the players. This will drive up the tension, being outnumbered in a tight space, surrounded by death. It's a scene straight from a horror movie. But again, we're not trying to kill the party, so what do? Well, in 4th edition there was a thing called minions, and they were basically copies of monsters from the game that had 1 hit point, so all it takes is 1 successful attack to beat them. It's a great way to make your players feel powerful as they slash through groups of enemies, especially at higher levels. So for this adventure, since we're building it for 5 adventurers, we'll have Durhar be supported by 5 skeleton minions that have 1 hit point each. Other than that, keeping the stat block the same is fine. Though, with the skeletons having a higher dexterity than our zombie, it may not make much sense why they're harder to hit without being creative. So if an attack misses, get creative with describing how the players miss. For example, if a player runs up to a skeleton and tries to stab them with a dagger and fails, describe how they would have hit had their weapon not gone straight through the skeleton's ribs. As long as your players have fun and believe what you're selling, you've done your job correctly.
Whew, so, between these past 2 videos, we've pretty much covered most of the basic mechanics you'll be facing when running your first game. Congratulations, you are now officially ready to be a dungeon master. You now have a solid adventure to send your friends on, complete with adventure hooks for future adventures, a basic grasp on the mechanics that you'll need to be ready for the game, and an idea for future installments of your game. If you stuck around through this whole video, let us know what you thought with a like and a comment, and thank you for your patience. In future episodes, we'll continue covering topics that will help you run the best game you could possibly run, no matter what type of tabletop RPG you decide to run. If you have a subject that you want us to tackle, let us know in the comments down below. We want to know what you want to see next, so your suggestions and feedback are deeply appreciated. Subscribe for future tabletop tips and other videos from the Arcane Opal. Aside from our Let's Play series Cryptic Consoles, we have other projects in the works that you don't want to miss. So until next time, may fortune find you in all your adventures.